Welcome to a journey into the origins of thought, where we will explore the minds that shape the very foundations of our understanding. Hello, my name is Mike, and I am the host of Mind Escape Podcast. I am happy to share my new series called Masters of Rhetoric. Masters of Rhetoric is a free course/podcast. The goal is to draw from the earliest philosophers, scientists, and critical thinkers to help navigate the current technological paradigm. In a world where divisive and heuristic rhetoric often dominate online spaces, I believe it's crucial to return to the roots of dialectic. This approach can offer the thoughtful discourse that humanity desperately needs today. So join us on this philosophical adventure by subscribing to our channel and podcast. Engage with us through your comments and critiques. We're excited to hear your thoughts. Let's embark on this journey together with Masters of Rhetoric. Enjoy the series. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion through the use of language. It involves the study and practice of effective communication, particularly in the areas of speaking and writing. Rhetoric is concerned with how messages are constructed to influence an audience, and it encompasses various techniques and strategies to make arguments more convincing, engaging, or emotionally resonant. Classically, rhetoric is divided into three main modes of persuasion. Number 1, ethos, appeals to the speaker's credibility or character. 2, pathos, appeals to the audience's emotions. And 3, logos, appeals to logic and reason. Rhetoric has been a central discipline in Western education since ancient Greece, where philosophers like Aristotle explored its principles and applications. It is used in various contexts, from political speeches, legal arguments, to advertising, everyday communication. Now, part of the reason why I'm doing this series, Masters of Rhetoric, is the crazy amount of heuristic rhetoric that you see on social media apps and online today. We will go into what heuristic rhetoric is and how it was employed and how it's still employed. That will be part of this series, but I just wanted to point that out. So we can move on now from the terms. This is a map I put together highlighting the origins and homes of all the pre-Socratic philosophers we will be discussing today. Starting from the left in Magna Graecia, which is modern-day Italy, we have Elia, which is where the Eleatic school was founded. To the right of Elia, we have Crotone, which is modern-day Calabria. Crotone is where Pythagoras had his ascetic number magic cult. To the right, across the Ionian Sea, we have Athens, which is where we will spend more time when we talk about Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle in future episodes. When most people think of ancient Greek philosophers, I imagine they think of a bearded guy in a toga walking through some pillars. I don't know if that's true. That's just usually how I think of other people thinking about philosophy. To the right of Athens, you have Miletus, which is where Thales, the first philosopher, founded the Milesian school. That Ionian coast, which is modern-day Western Turkey, was a hotbed of natural philosophers looking for non-teleological explanations for nature and natural phenomena. So the cradle of philosophy basically stretched from Elia, which is on the western coast of modern-day Italy, all the way to Miletus, which is on the Ionian coast, which is modern-day Western Turkey. And fun fact, my family, or my relatives, are from Calabria, which is the region we discussed where Pythagoras had his number magic cult. So, moving on. Before we get started, I do want to point out that if any of this information is contradictory to something you know, or you have something to add, or please leave a comment, send me an email, something like that. I'm happy to fix anything that's wrong or add anything special. This is as much credible information as I could find on the pre-Socratics. So, Thales of Miletus, known as the first Western philosopher. He lived between 623 and 545 BC. He was one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. He was the first philosopher to have engaged in non-teleological natural scientific observation, which means that he was looking into the natural world around him, and instead of relying on the gods or the pantheon of Greek gods, that he was looking for natural explanations for how things work in nature. So, which is huge. I mean, that's a massive paradigm shift right there. He is known for breaking from the tradition, again, of not using mythology to explain the universe. He was the first person to use theories and hypotheses to explain natural objects and phenomenon. Aristotle noted him as the founder of the Ionian school. Again, that very specific coast of Western Turkey and Ionia. So, like, most people don't realize this, but the Greek Empire at one point was huge and it fluctuated, but you have a lot of influence between Western Turkey all the way to what's now Italy in regards to what we're talking about today. Okay. He hypothesized that the origin of nature and matter came from a single material substance, which was water. He was the first material monist. Again, I mentioned monism at the beginning. It's this idea that everything is made out of one fundamental thing. And his hypothesis or theory, however you want to use that interchangeably, because people do it all the time, and it's hard to keep up with. I mean, there's strict scientific explanations for these things, and then people use these terms loosely as well. So, but he speculated that water, since we need water to live, and most living things do need water, that is the original thing, or the one substance that makes up everything, which is not a bad guess for the first person to deviate from God's made everything or a God made something to what we know now via science. That is not a bad guess. It's not right, but it's not a bad guess. He used geometry to calculate the height of the Great Pyramids, which he did travel to Egypt when he was younger. According to Herodotus, Thales predicted a solar eclipse in 585 BC. Now, I don't know anybody personally, other than maybe some astronomers that we have had on the Mind Escape podcast, but I don't know anybody personally that could probably figure that out. So that's super impressive, especially back then, given the technology that they had. Being a mathematician and astronomer is not, we don't have the tools that we obviously have today, so it is very different. It says Thales died 30 years before the time of Pythagoras and 300 years before the time of Euclid, but was considered the first mathematician as well. When Thales was asked what was difficult, he said, to know oneself, and what was easy was to advise another. His most famous advice, know thyself, was engraved on the front of the temple of Apollo at Delphi and was attributed to Thales and the 7 sages. But it was actually made most famous by Socrates. He was the first to use deductive reasoning in relation to mathematics, and he also thought that magnets were either alive or had some level of animism, which, again, we know to not be true, but back then you have 2 magnets and they're influencing and moving each other without any visible field around it, and that's kind of where you get the guess from the guy that's the first person to at least record these thoughts regarding nature. The most famous anecdote of Thales is probably about his business acumen and also, again, an observation of nature, which is that, so it was all, back then, it was all up to the gods based, on how the harvests would be and everything like that. He realized that the more it rained, the more olives would be produced. So what he did was he went around, and during the next rainy season, he bought up all the olive presses. so that when they had this huge flux of olives coming in during the harvest, people had to come to him for the machines, and he just raked in loot. And he didn't need the money, but it was just another exercise of him understanding what a lot of people back then didn't, which is that there are natural explanations for these things, and people that are chalking everything up to the gods, well, they're kind of missing the whole point here. So he is definitely a paradigm shifter, if there ever was one, in terms of just moving everything away from the old ways, the old gods, how things used to work, how people used to think, that kind of a thing. Solon. You might have heard Solon's name come up when discussing Atlantis, as he was the one who passed down the story of Atlantis to Plato. But let's go through some of his other contributions. He lived from 630 to 560 BC. He was an Athenian statesman. He was a lawmaker. He was a poet. He laid the foundations for Athenian democracy. According to Herodotus, Solon visited the pharaoh of Egypt, Amasis II. According to Plutarch, Solon discussed philosophy with two Egyptian priests, Xenophus of Heliopolis and Sancus of Sais. According to Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, Solon visited Neith's temple at Sais and received from priests there an account of the history of Atlantis. He was an ancestor supposedly 3 generations removed from Plato on Plato's mother's side. He was known for his political and economical reform. Solon aimed to reduce the power of aristocrats and increase participation of common people in government. He implemented laws to promote economic fairness, such as banning the export of all agricultural products except olive oil, to ensure that there was enough food for the Athenians. Solon was also a poet, and his poetry often reflected his political views and ideals of justice and moderation. His verses were used to explain and justify his reforms to the public. Solon's reforms laid the foundation for later development of Athenian democracy. Although his reforms did not immediately resolve all of Athens' social and economic issues, they were crucial in preventing the rise of tyranny and setting the stage for future democratic governance. He is often credited with saving Athens from civil strife and setting it on the path to becoming a major power in the ancient world. Solon is remembered as a key figure in Athenian history whose reform had a lasting impact on political and social structure of the city-state. Now, Solon wasn't a traditional pre-Socratic in the sense that he was a pure philosopher, but I added him in here because I do believe that he did contribute things and was one of the first thinkers or critical thinkers in these regards, similar to Thales, so I added him in here. Anaximander, who was the student of Thales from the Milesian school. He lived from 610 to 546 BC. After Thales, he became the second master of the Milesian school. He taught Anaximenes and possibly Pythagoras. He was the first philosopher to write down his studies. Only one of his works survived, but testimonies from other historical works provide a picture of who he was. He was a material monist that believed the Apeiron, which means limitless or infinite in cosmological terms, was the source of all things. He also used arche, first in philosophical terms, which meant origin or beginning. He was the first to theorize the earth floats still in the infinite, not supported by anything. He's referenced by some as the father of cosmology. His theories of the universe were trending towards demystifying natural phenomena and processes. Anaximander speculated that life began in the water and that humans and other land animals evolved from aquatic forms. This is one of the earliest recorded theories of evolution. He suggested that humans originated from fish-like creatures, arguing that early humans would have needed to develop over a long time in a safer environment before being able to survive on land. Babies supposedly lived in the bellies of a fish until they were ready to be born. He was the first to speculate on the plurality of worlds, meaning multiple worlds. He attributed thunder and lightning to natural processes as opposed to divine causes. He was said to be the first to publish a map of the world. Here's a little thing that he wrote on the Apeiron. Whence things have their origin, thence also their destruction happens, according to necessity, for they give each other justice and recompense for their injustice, in conformity with the ordinance of time. Again, he's following with the progression of the Milesian school. Thales set the tone for natural explanations. Now you have Anaximander picking up the torch and carrying that torch. And next we have Anaximander's student Anaximenes. He lived from 586 to 526 BC. Also from Miletus, the city in Ionia, which is known as modern-day Western Turkey. He was a student or associate of Anaximander. Primary substance, or arche. Anaximenes proposed that air is the fundamental substance of the universe from which everything else is derived. He believed that air is infinite and eternal, similar to the concept of the Apeiron introduced by Anaximander, but more specific and tangible. Processes of rarefaction and condensation. Anaximenes explained the transformation of air into different forms of matter through the process of rarefaction and condensation. Rarefaction is when air is rarefied or expanded, it becomes fire. Condensation, when air is condensed, and it first becomes wind, then clouds, then water, then earth, and then finally stone. This process accounts for the various forms of matter observed in the natural world. He suggested that the sun, moon, and stars are all comprised of rarefied air and are all carried around the earth by rotation of the heavens. So here you have Anaximenes' version of monism. Again, not right, but you see a trend here. You have Thales, with his version, which is water. His version of monism is water. And then you have Anaximander, whose version is the Apeiron, which is the limitless infinite. And then you have air is basically what Anaximenes' monism is. Anaximenes associated air with the soul, considered it life-giving principle in living beings. He believed that just as air sustains the cosmos, it also sustains life. He also continued the tradition and the transition from myth to natural explanation. Anaximenes continued the Milesian tradition of seeking natural explanations for the origins and workings of the universe while moving away from the mythological interpretations. He provided naturalistic explanations for meteorological phenomena such as rain, hail, lightning, and attributing them to the processes of condensation and rarefaction of air. While less well-known than some of his other contemporaries, Anaximenes' focus on a single underlying substance and processes of transformation influenced later pre-Socratic thinkers and contributed to the development of natural philosophy. Again, like most of these people, monism's almost like a basic form of a theory of everything, in a sense. Not that it explains everything, but it's trying to. Anaximenes is remembered for his attempt to explain natural phenomena through observable processes and for his contribution to the early development of scientific thought in ancient Greece. Xenophanes. Xenophanes lived from 570 to 475 BC. He was a Greek philosopher, theologian, poet, and critic. He left Ionia at the age of 25 and traveled the world for 76 years. He used satire to critique the polytheistic views of his contemporaries Homer and Hesiod. Homer and Hesiod, most of you are probably familiar with Homer. Hesiod is another Greek poet, which a lot of the people of ancient Greece, before we get into the natural philosophy and early science and everything was predicated on Homer's poems and Hesiod and their writings and the Iliad and the Odyssey and all that. So, but he believed that they were projecting and anthropomorphizing God through their work. Xenophanes is well known for his criticism of anthropomorphic depiction of gods in Greek religion. He argued that if animals had gods, they would depict them in their own image just as humans do. He wrote about wet and dry, or water and earth. He theorized that these two states would alternate pushing human life into extinction, and then it would regenerate, and vice versa, depending on the dominant form. This would suggest that he believed in causation, which is a major contribution to the evolution of scientific thinking. Through examining fossils, he believed the Earth must have been completely covered by water at some point. He believed there are an infinite number of worlds not overlapping in time. He was one of the first philosophers to distinguish between true belief and knowledge. He theorized that celestial bodies like the sun and the moon were made of ignited clouds and that they were not divine entities but natural phenomena. He believed the sun was new every day and the stars were kindled and extinguished periodically. His epistemology, which is still relevant to this day, states that there is a truth of reality, but it is unknowable to mortal humans. His skepticism about human knowledge and his criticism of religious practices made him an important figure in the development of early Greek philosophy. Now we get to Pythagoras, and most people have heard of Pythagoras, but if you haven't, we will go through everything. And most people have heard of him through his theorem, the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras lived from 570 to 495 BC. He was an Ionian Greek philosopher. He was the founder of Pythagoreanism. His philosophies influenced Plato, Aristotle, and most of Western philosophy. His political and religious ideas were influential. He was born on the island of Samos in the Aegean Sea. He created an ascetic commune/cult and school in Crotone, which is modern-day Calabria, Italy, where initiates were sworn to secrecy. He taught metum or metum psychosis, which is the transmigrations of the soul, that upon death the soul enters a new body. His transmigration cult could have been influenced by Orphism, which is an ancient Greek cult that predated Pythagoras. The only way out of the reincarnation cycle was supposedly to live an ascetic life. His followers, I believe, had to be vegetarian or vegan and just live a wholesome, again, ascetic life. And the idea is that the soul is immortal and then reincarnates after death. And they believed that your soul could enter a body of an animal or whatever. He created the Pythagorean theorem, the 5 regular solids, and the theory of proportions. He studied in Egypt and was fascinated by the Egyptian god Thoth, also known as Hermes. He studied with the Egyptian priests at Thebes. He learned to speak Egyptian from the pharaoh Amasis II himself. He may have invented the harmony of spheres, which is the idea that the planets move according to mathematical equations, causing a resonant vibration that is an inaudible symphony tied to math, religion, and harmonic resonance. He coined the term philosopher. He may have been the first to make the connection between mathematics and music. There is an anecdote of him listening to blacksmiths work, and one anvil was double the size of another, and it made the tone of an octave. He then connected math and tones. Harmonies are mathematical ratios. Below you have an example of something he created called the Teractus. Heraclitus. Heraclitus lived from 535 to 475 BC. He was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. He was from Ephesus, which is located on the Ionian coast. He was self-taught and led a lonely life. He was known as the weeping philosopher and also the obscure, and he was said to have gained his knowledge from questioning himself. He focused on metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and cosmology. He was considered to be one of the two founders of ontology. He coined the term logos, which means principle of order and knowledge. The term was used in different ways by the sophists and other ancient Greeks. He developed the philosophical concept of becoming, which is the possibility of change in a thing that has being. He was a material monist that believed fire was the arche. He also believed that the essence of the universe is ever-present change. He is most famous for saying, "No man ever steps in the same river twice," which is one of the most famous philosophical sayings of all time. And what he means by that is that when you step in a river, pull your foot out, and let's say you put it back in, by then the exact particles and water molecules and everything are completely different. So it's not technically the same river. So we can debate that. Lots of people do, but that is what he meant by that. He died of dropsy, also known as edema. He did not listen to the medical physicians that were advising him, and he tried to treat himself by burying himself in cow manure and then died later that day. Heraclitus wrote a single work, traditionally titled On Nature. These fragments are often enigmatic and aporistic, contributing to his reputation as the obscure or the riddler. Heraclitus's ideas profoundly influenced later philosophical traditions, particularly the Stoics, who adopted and adapted his concept of the logos. He was not considered a friendly guy, and he was always angry and considered a curmudgeon. He would play dice all day long. He had a quote saying something along the lines of, people are like infants and their opinions are like their toys. His divine logos meant universal cosmic law. Everything is one thing on a spectrum. Parmenides. Parmenides lived from 515 to 450 BC. According to Plato's Parmenides dialogue, Parmenides was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher from Elea. He founded the Eleatic school of philosophy. He was a student of Xenophanes. He was a teacher of Zeno. His single surviving work was a poem called On Nature. His main focuses were metaphysics and ontology, which is the study of being. His most famous thoughts were, "Thought and being are the same. Nothing comes from nothing, the void." He argued that the perception of everyday life and reality of the physical world is wrong, and that reality was actually one being. Parmenides is best known for his doctrine that being is and non-being is not. He argued that reality is unchanging, eternal, and indivisible, and that all change or multiplicity is an illusion. This marks a radical departure from earlier thinkers who believed in the reality of change. Parmenides asserted that change, motion, and diversity are impossible because they imply the existence of non-being, which he argued is a logical contradiction. According to Parmenides, what truly exists is a single, unchanging, and homogeneous reality. Parmenides emphasized the role of reason over the senses in understanding the truth. He believed that sensory perception is deceptive and cannot lead to genuine knowledge, which can only be attained through rational thought. Parmenides' philosophy represents a turning point in ancient Greek thought, shifting the focus from cosmology to ontology, the study of being. His work laid the groundwork for the development of metaphysics and introduced the trajectory of Western philosophy. Parmenides is remembered as one of the most profound and challenging thinkers of the pre-Socratic era, whose ideas continue to be studied and debated. Parmenides diverged from Democritus by thinking empty space is impossible, but otherwise they had similar metaphysics. He wrote in hexameter verse, which is super rare way to write and also hard to understand. Zeno. Zeno lived from 490 to 430 BC. He is known as Zeno of Elea. He was a Greek philosopher. He was a member of the Eleatic school founded by Parmenides. Aristotle credited him with being the inventor of dialectic. He is mentioned in Plato's Parmenides dialogue and Aristotle's physics. He was possibly the first philosopher to dabble in mathematical infinity. He is most famous for creating 9 paradoxes. Achilles and the tortoise. This paradox argues that a faster runner, Achilles, can never overtake a slower one, a tortoise, if the slower runner has a head start, because Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise started, by which time the tortoise has moved further ahead. The dichotomy paradox. This paradox suggests that motion is impossible because before an object can travel a certain distance, it must first travel half that distance, and before that half of the half, ad infinitum. The infinite division implies that motion can never begin. The arrow paradox. Zeno argues that if you consider an arrow in flight at a single instant of time, it is at rest, because at that instant it occupies a space equal to itself. If it is at rest every instant, then it must be at rest for the entire time of its flight. The paradox of the grain of millet. Zeno questions the concept of divisibility by pointing out that if a single grain of millet makes no sound when it falls, then how can a bushel of millet, which is just a collection of single grains, make a sound? Zeno's paradoxes were intended to defend Parmenides' doctrine of the oneness and unchanging nature of reality by showing the absurdities and contradictions that arise from assuming the reality of motion, change, and plurality. His arguments challenge the reliability of sensory experience and support the idea that reason alone can reveal the truth about the nature of reality. Methodology. Reductio ad absurdum. Zeno is often credited with developing the method of reductio ad absurdum, where an argument is refuted by demonstrating that its logical consequences lead to absurd or contradictory results. This technique became a fundamental tool in later philosophical and mathematical reasoning. Democritus. Democritus is probably one of the most influential pre-socratics in terms of influencing modern science and philosophy. So let's take a look. Democritus lived from 460 to 370 BC. He was born in Abdera, a city in Thrace, Greece. His name means chosen of the people. He is most famous for inventing the concept of atoms and atomic theory. The term atom comes from the Greek word atomos, which means indivisible. The term was not used again until scientists and chemists started using it in the early 19th century. There is a debate if the idea was originally Democritus or his teacher Leucippus. Aristotle credited Leucippus with inventing atomism. Democritus is best known for developing the theory of atomism. He proposed that the universe is composed of 2 fundamental elements, indivisible and indestructible atoms, atomos meaning uncuttable, and the void, which is empty space, in which they move. According to Democritus, atoms are infinite in number. They vary in shape and size and combine in various ways to form all matter. These combinations account for the diversity of the physical world. Epicurus was influenced by Democritus and based his testimony Leucippus never existed. People still debate these matters to this day. Again, I want to point out a lot of what we know is from fragmented texts, third-hand accounts, later philosophers writing about these older philosophers, and things of that nature. So some of these things have crossover in terms of who gets credit between 2 people, or a student of a teacher getting credit, or vice versa. So just keep that in mind. I mean, we're talking about over 2,000 years ago. So there is no real way of knowing other than just what we know, again, through texts and accounts and what we have. Eudaimonia, or happiness or flourishing, Democritus believed that happiness is the ultimate goal of life and can be achieved through moderation, self-discipline, and cultivating a contented and tranquil state of mind. He emphasized the importance of living a virtuous life in accordance with nature. Relativism. He held that ethical values such as good and evil are relative to individuals and cultures, but he also believed in the pursuit of a balanced life guided by reason. Void hypothesis. He believed, contrary to Parmenides and Zeno's motion paradox, that a void must exist. Parmenides and Zeno believed a void cannot exist, since nothing is still something. He believed the knowledge of truth is difficult since perception through the senses is subjective. Democritus believed that all natural phenomena, including human thoughts and actions, are a result of the interactions and motions of atoms, following natural law without the involvement of chance or divine intervention. Democritus distinguished between two types of knowledge: true-born knowledge, which is obtained through reason and intellect, and bastard knowledge, which is obtained through the senses and often deceptive. Infinite universe. Democritus proposed that the universe is infinite in both space and time, containing countless worlds, some of which may be inhabited. So now you have speculation that, Giordano Bruno, infinite worlds with infinite life, you get there through here. And you could say that this is the beginning of the thought that, like, maybe there's somebody else out there like us, or maybe there's other humans on another world, maybe there's aliens, so on, or extraterrestrial life. He believed that the universe operates without any purpose or design, governed solely by natural interactions of atoms and void. He claimed there was no afterlife. The story of how he discovered the theory of atomism is he saw particles of dust in a shaft of light in a dusty shed on a sunny day. So just imagine that. You're in ancient Greece, you go in some sort of a shed, and we've all been there. We've all been in a dusty room or a house or whatever. You're looking around and you see all those dust particles and just little things in the air. And that's where the idea of atomism comes from. So, and then again, it wouldn't be used till a long time later, till maybe the 17th century. It was kind of shelved because of all of Plato's work. He wrote more books than all the other works produced by all the other pre-Socratics. He specifically inspired Galileo, Robert Boyle, and John Locke. At this point of the course or podcast, I just want to thank everybody for paying attention and listening. I know some of it's dry. I know maybe some of it's hard to understand and interpret, but I do believe there's a lot of knowledge here. So I will also offer a PDF if anybody's interested. And I'm sure there's some typos and stuff I'll have to work out as I go. But now we get to the conclusions part of it. Which pre-Socratic philosopher do you think had the largest impact on modern thinking, and why? How do you think these ancient thinkers were able to arrive at some of these conclusions? Many of their theories and ideas were wrong based on what we know now because of science and technology, but still amazingly impressive and influential. I mean, if you think about everybody we just talked about, there was bits and pieces that were right, and then you get to Democritus, and we're still going based on the atom, but we already assigned the term atom to a specific particle, but Democritus is undividable atom, because you're saying, oh, haven't we divided or split the atom? Yes, we have. So, but his version of it might still be yet to be discovered. So that's something to think about. But regardless, many of these thinkers had different contributions, and then you see this causal line of thinking slowly evolve from, beginning with the Milesian school and the Eleatic school, and then eventually we will get to the Academy and Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, and then you'll see this slow build of knowledge and building off of one another's hypotheses and observations and things like that. So Yeah, I think it's super impressive and super amazing how a lot of these people were able to come up with that. But if you think about it, they didn't have the distractions that we have with technology. Back then, there was a lot more disciplined of thinkers. These people sat around thinking all day. They developed tools on how to think. We don't do that. We currently just take things from the internet or read something, take it in, and then regurgitate it. That's what most people do. So just something to think about. Do you think technology is helping or hindering our evolution of consciousness? Do you think the non-teleological explanations and theories put forth by the Ionian natural philosophers were the catalyst for a paradigm shift in understanding of our universe better? Meaning, did Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes change the game in terms of now instead of gods and goddesses and things like that, we have natural explanations which will eventually lead to science. And here we are today using science to further our exploration and understanding of the universe. I 100% believe that that was the catalyst for a paradigm shift. Did you learn anything new about these ancient thinkers that you can implement into your own life or philosophies? Did this episode provide you with insights into the origins of how we got to where we are today with science and philosophy? Did I leave anybody notable off this list of pre-Socratics? If so, who? Please add any contributions. I just want to point out that the whole point of this conclusions part is to take in everything from the slideshow, from the episode, and continue thinking about it more than just going over it, because anybody can sit there and memorize things. It's more important that you understand the origins and the progression and the causality that led to some of these ideas and the way we think about the universe and how we got here. This is episode number 2 of Masters of Rhetoric. We have Socrates and Plato we will be discussing today. And if you missed the first episode, I highly recommend you go back and check it out. It is on the pre-Socratics and the first philosophers or Ionian physicists. So again, please go check that out. It does have some relevance to where Socrates and Plato and their ideas came from too. So again, I highly recommend listening or watching that episode. Here we have 2 statues. We have Socrates on the left and Plato on the right. Teacher and student. Here is the Parthenon in Athens. We'll be discussing Athens a lot in this episode. And we are going to start with Socrates. Socrates lived from 470 to 399 BC. He was a classical Greek philosopher from Athens. He was the founder of Western philosophy and was credited with being the first moral philosopher of Western ethical thought. He did not write or record any of his teachings or philosophies, but his students Plato and Xenophon did write his philosophies and teachings, along with other contemporaries. I think Aristophanes also wrote about him in some of his plays. Plato's dialogues are the most comprehensive accounts of Socrates' teachings and philosophies, which highlight his contributions to ethics and epistemology. Socrates used Socratic irony to confuse adversaries in dialogues and debates. He also used the Socratic method, which would lead adversaries and students to critically think and ultimately to conclusions that would contradict their initial position and help further their knowledge. This was all described in one of Plato's dialogues called the Theaetetus. He was falsely accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and was executed by way of poison, which they used hemlock. Xenophon wrote that Socrates was a teleologist and suggested God arranges everything for the best. Socrates was considered a moral and just philosopher. He proved it in the way that he lived and the way he died. Now, we know Socrates was a real person based on, obviously, Plato's dialogues. We also have Xenophon, and we have Aristophanes. Now, Plato portrayed Socrates as more than just a wise person. On the other hand, Xenophon portrayed Socrates as merely a wise person. So we kind of have a little bit of a discrepancy there, and we'll get into why that may be the case here in a second. But again, we have multiple accounts from different people. All consider him to be a wise person, but I think the degree of which people revered him might have been slightly different. After Athens lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta, Socrates got himself into trouble for being critical of Athenian democracy and its powerful politicians. He praised Sparta on certain topics in the dialogues. Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens via impiety and being a sophist. He was none of the things he was accused of being. Since he did not write or record anything, most of what we know about him are from Plato's dialogues. He did not believe in writing things down. We will get to that here in a little bit. Socrates was such a moral and ethical philosopher that he even turned down his friend Crito's offer to escape his execution. The Socratic paradoxes are: no one deserves evil, no one errs or does wrong willingly or knowingly, virtue, all virtue is knowledge. Virtue is sufficient for happiness. His quotes, "I know that I know nothing," is from Plato's Apology. Socrates believed moral order was very important. He saw the Ionian physicists and sophists as somewhat of a threat to moral order since they lacked telos. Socrates never charged money for dialogues or teachings. He was not a wealthy man. Socrates associated justice with being a social animal accountable to others, as referenced in Plato's Republic. Socrates used mathematics to drive his points home in the dialogues. We will also discuss that. Pythagoras was a huge influence on Socrates and Plato, but if you look at when they're making arguments and getting into dialogues, whether it's Plato writing it or maybe it was originally from Socrates' teachings, Plato and Socrates will use math to kind of drive their points home. It starts to diverge when you get to Aristotle, because Aristotle will then start to use more biology and empiricism to drive his points home. But it did start off with being more math and logic based in these arguments, and then worked its way to, when you get to Aristotle, biology and empiricism. Plato speaks as Socrates in the dialogues except for Laws, which was his last dialogue. Why didn't Socrates write anything down? The main reason was his belief in the superiority of oral dialogue over written text. Socrates thought conversation was a dynamic and interactive process that allowed for questioning, clarification, and deep exploration of ideas. He believed that writing was static and unable to adapt to the needs of a conversation or the evolving understanding of a subject. Another possible reason was Socrates was worried that his writing might give people the illusion of knowledge. He argued that reading a text could make people think that they understood something without truly engaging in critical thinking or understanding underlying principles. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates famously critiques writing, saying that it weakens the mind by reducing the need for memory and active intellectual engagement. Now, how many of us have been on the internet and seen Dunning-Kruger effect or heuristic rhetoric just all over the place? So these are things that he was worried about or have come true via technology and the internet. Not to say that they didn't exist, obviously, back then. They did, but now you have a whole online community of these things happening. A third possible reason is Socrates viewed his philosophical mission as a form of cross-examination or refutation aimed at encouraging others to think for themselves. Writing might have contradicted his method, which was deeply rooted in personal, live dialogue and dialectic inquiry. Here is a statue or picture of Plato, or what he may have looked like. Here is another one. Plato lived roughly from 424 to 348 BC. He was a classical Greek philosopher from Athens. Plato was the student of Socrates, Heraclitus, and Parmenides. In episode 1, we discussed Heraclitus and Parmenides. You can go check that out. But yes, he was a student of all three of those brilliant thinkers. Plato founded the Platonist school of thought, which was called the Academy, and it was the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. Plato was credited with being one of the founders of spirituality in Western religion through a chain of Neoplatonic thinkers. We're going to discuss more of Socrates and Plato in the future, and part of that is Plato's influence. Obviously, he's influencing people to this day, but his influence on Christianity and religion and spirituality and stuff like that. So we will eventually get into that. So this is just that general background information, what we do know, kind of stuff about Plato and Socrates, but again, we will get deeper as we go into this series. So Plato created the written forms of dialogues and dialectics. Plato is also credited with Western political philosophy. Plato was the son of Ariston and Perictione. He had a sister named Protone and two brothers named Adeimantus and Glaucon. Glaucon was Plato's older brother. Glaucon was the interlocutor in the allegory of the cave, but best known as a main conversant with Socrates in the Republic. Plato invented the theory of forms, in which he puts forth the idea that abstract objects exist outside the human mind. This is known as Platonic realism or Platonic idealism. The world of concrete objects and an unchanged, unseen world of forms or abstract objects. Plato studied in Egypt, Italy, Sicily, and Cyrene. Plato invented Platonic love and Platonic solids. Plato believed in the immortality of the soul. This is discussed in the Timaeus. He has Socrates locate parts of the soul. Now we get to Plato's dialogues. In the dialogues, Plato never speaks as himself in the dialogues. He only speaks as Socrates, except for the laws, which was his last dialogue. Aristotle makes a distinction between Socrates' theory of form and Plato's. He believes Socrates' idea of forms was more tied to the investigation of the physical world, while Plato's idea of forms existed outside the scope of human understanding. In the dialogue, Socrates appears to have a mystical side when discussing the mystery religions and reincarnation, but people more associate these ideas with Plato. The common theme throughout the dialogues is the trial of Socrates, which ended in his execution. Apology is Socrates' defense speech. Credo and Phaedo take place in prison after he is found guilty of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens and being a sophist. In the Credo, his wealthy friend Credo offers to finance his escape, but Socrates says an injustice may not be answered with an injustice. In the Phaedo, Socrates discusses the soul and immortality in the hours leading up to his execution, where he was forced to drink hemlock. In the Apology, Socrates also says the unexamined life is not worth living. Plato's theory of forms is highlighted in the Republic. There is the allegory of the cave, the analogy of the sun, and the divided line. Plato describes the lost civilization of Atlantis in the Timaeus and the Critias. It was passed down from Solon 3 generations to Plato. Plato was said to be related to Solon on his mother's side. Solon is believed to have been told the story of Atlantis from Sankis, an Egyptian priest, while he was in Sais, Egypt. People argue to this day whether Atlantis was a real civilization lost to the sea or just a myth. And if you're interested in that, you can check out Mind Escape Podcast, because we've discussed this ad nauseum. Some of the dialogues that don't have a narrator are Credo, Euthyphro, Gorgias, Meno, and the Phaedrus. The dialogues that are narrated by Socrates are Charmides, the Republic, and Lysis. Plato used Socratic method in some early dialogues like Euthyphro and Ion. In later dialogues like Theaetetus and Sophist, Plato has Socrates use dialectical method. The dialectical method is similar to a debate in that it excludes subjective elements. Here's a list of all of Plato's dialogues in somewhat chronological order. Again, if I got something wrong or something seems out of place, just let me know. Send me an email or something, and I'll try and add a note to it or something like that. But This is the best that I can do. So his early dialogues, you have the Apology, Charmides, Credo, Euthyphro, Gorgias, Hippias Minor, Hippias Major, Ion, Lacus, Lysis, and Protagoras. In the middle, you have Cratylus, Euthydemus, Meno, Parmenides, Phaedo, Phaedrus, Republic, Symposium, and Theaetetus. Now, I think his middle period is probably his best work. Obviously, you have the Republic in there, which is considered one of the best pieces of writing still. But you also have the Phaedo and the Phaedrus, Meno, and in Meno you're talking about virtue, and then you have Euthydemus talking about eristic rhetoric. His late period, you have the Critias, Sophist, Statesman, Timaeus, Philebus, and Laws. Now, one of the main differences between Plato and Socrates is Plato was very interested and consumed with metaphysics, the mind, and even some cosmology, where you have Socrates, who is primarily concerned with ethics and moral order and things of that nature. So there is a little bit of a divergence there. We don't know how much of who is who, if that makes sense. So how much of what we know about Socrates was from Plato's influence or his interpretation, and how much of it was actually Socrates. And then we don't know much about Plato other than what he's written, because he writes as Socrates. So just pointing that out. Gorgias is a dialogue between Socrates and a bunch of sophists at a dinner party. Socrates debates Gorgias about the true definition of rhetoric. Protagoras is a dialogue where 21 people are present, including 3 sophists. Socrates and an old Protagoras argue over whether virtue can be taught. Socrates wins the argument by pointing out that if all virtue is knowledge, then it can be taught. In Cratylus, Socrates is asked by Cratylus and Hermogenes whether the names are natural or conventional, and whether language has an intrinsic relation to the things they represent, or it is just a system of arbitrary signs. Euthydemus. Socrates engages in a dialogue with 2 sophists who are brothers, Euthydemus and Dionysodorus. Plato writes this dialogue as a satire on the logical fallacies of the sophists. The brothers try to demonstrate philosophical superiority over Socrates by using eristic arguments, which are used to successfully dispute another's argument and disregard the search for truth. The brothers are portrayed as not being very smart, with Euthydemus being the more intelligent of the brothers. Meno. Meno is a dialogue where Meno and Socrates discuss the definition of virtue. Meno wants Socrates to just give him all the answers. This is when Socrates starts to employ the Socratic method to trick Meno into thinking for himself. Parmenides is a dialogue where a young Socrates meets Parmenides and Zeno of Elea. The reason for meeting was Zeno reading his treatise defending Parmenidean monism. This is considered the most challenging of the dialogues. Phaedo. Phaedo is a dialogue where Socrates discusses immortality, the soul, and the afterlife. It takes place in the hours leading up to his execution, and it is one of the most read dialogues. Phaedrus and Symposium are both dialogues that take on the topic of love. The Republic. The Republic takes on justice, order, and character. The idea of the hypothetical city of Callipolis, ruled by a philosopher king, is discussed. The immortality of the soul and theory of forms are discussed. This dialogue also contains the allegory of the cave, where Socrates and Plato's brother Glaucon imagine a cave where prisoners are chained up only to be able to see their shadows their whole life until one of them escapes. This dialogue is Plato's crown jewel and considered one of the greatest and most influential pieces of writing of all time. Theaetetus. Socrates and Theaetetus discuss the definitions of knowledge. Socrates says Theaetetus benefited from knowing what he did not know and should revisit the topic in the future. The Critias. The Critias described how the great lost civilization of Atlantis tried to conquer Athens, but failed due to the ordered society of the Athenians. Sophist. Sophists tried to identify what a sophist is and how it differs from a statesman or a philosopher. The Timaeus. The Timaeus is a dialogue between Socrates, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates. They speculate on the nature of human beings and the physical world. Critias tells the story of Solon's journey to Egypt, where he is told the story of Atlantis. Philebus. Socrates discusses pleasure, ethics, dialectics, and ontology with the other interlocutors. I know that seemed kind of short, but I just wanted to get some general stuff out there about Plato and Socrates, who they were. There's a lot of weird stuff online. There's some people that don't think that Socrates actually existed and he was basically invented by Plato, but again, we have other accounts from Xenophon and Aristophanes and others. So, yeah. But these are the conclusions or questions that I came up with for the end. I was going to maybe add Aristotle into this, but there's just so much stuff for all three of them. And again, I just wanted to get general information out there about who Plato and Socrates were. We'll go deeper as we go deeper into the series on them as well as others. So, questions and conclusions. Why do you think Plato's philosophies and theories have transcended thousands of years to present, given the advancements we have made technologically? Why did Plato, and for that matter Socrates, use math to drive their points home? Do you think technology is helping or hindering our evolution of consciousness? Do you think the non-teleological explanations and theories put forth by the Ionian natural philosophers were a danger to moral order like Socrates predicted? What was something you learned about Plato or Socrates that you connect to? Did this episode provide you with insights into the origins of how we got to where we are today with science and philosophy? Which one of Plato's dialogues do you think is the most relevant to this current paradigm, and why? Do you think Socrates was closer to Plato's description of him or Xenophon's? Do you think Plato was onto something when he was warning us about sophists and sophistry? Please feel free to leave any comments or critiques. Masters of Rhetoric, episode number 3, Aristotle. Aristotle lived between 384 and 322 BC. He was born in Stagiria, northern Greece, and died in Euboea, Greece. Aristotle was a classical Greek philosopher and a polymath. A polymath is someone who excels in multiple disciplines. Aristotle founded the Lyceum and the Peripatetic school of philosophy. Aristotelianism is a school of thought or tradition inspired by the work of Aristotle. This school of thought influenced early Christian and Islamic philosophers. Aristotle was considered one of the fathers of Western philosophy. Aristotle's writings covered many topics such as metaphysics, physics, biology, psychology, zoology, logic, politics, economics, rhetoric, linguistics, ethics, aesthetics, theater, poetry, and music. Between the age of 17 and 18, Aristotle joined Plato's academy in Athens. He studied there as a student until around the age of 37. After Plato died, Aristotle left Athens. He took King Philip II of Macedonia's offer up to teach and tutor his son Alexander the Great, starting around 343 BC, when Alexander was around the age of 13. Aristotle's physical science had a huge influence on science and academics until the Enlightenment in the 18th century. He was the first one to study formal logic. This was the dominant form of logic in Western philosophy until mathematical logic made advancements in the 19th century. He applied deductive reasoning to arrive at a conclusion based on two or more propositions that are assumed to be true. Empiricism. Unlike Plato, who emphasized ideal forms and abstract reasoning, Aristotle focused on empirical observation, stressing that knowledge comes from sensory experience and careful analysis of the natural world. Aristotle wrote dialogues that were preserved in forms of treatises. His most notable works were On the Soul, Poetics, Politics, Physics, Metaphysics, and Nicomachean Ethics. In the work Metaphysics, he discusses substance and essence. His philosophical theory, hylomorphism, states that things are comprised of both matter and form. His teacher Plato believed that there was a separate world of forms that actual things imitate in this reality. Aristotle deviated from that thought and believed that things were an overlapping of form and matter. When it comes to epistemology, Aristotle's immanent realism means his knowledge is based on the study of things and observations of the natural world and rises to the universal. Plato's epistemological views came from the realm of the universal forms and worked its way down to the natural world, which he believed were imitations of the true realm of forms. Even though Aristotle was Plato's student, you can see their epistemological views come from opposite ends of the spectrum. Out of all ancient Greek philosophers, Aristotle had the largest influence on what we call modern science. His natural philosophy examined the phenomena of the natural world. Today, that would translate into biology, physics, and natural sciences. Aristotle built on Empedocles' theory of the four elements. The elements were earth, water, air, and fire. Aristotle added the ether as the fifth element. He believed ether was the divine substance of the heavenly spheres, planets, and stars. Aristotle believed that there was four causes of how things came to be. Number 1, material cause. Describe the material that things are composed of. Number 2, formal cause. The essence or arrangement of that matter. Number 3, efficient cause. The primary source. This is related to the modern definitions of cause. Final cause, or telos. The purpose of a thing or why something is done. It was Aristotle who formalized and extensively developed the art of rhetoric in his work, or treatise, Rhetoric. Aristotle defined rhetoric as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion, laying out the three main modes of persuasion: ethos, which is credibility; pathos, which is emotional appeal; and logos, which is logical argument. There was rhetoric earlier employed by the early sophists and found in Plato's dialogues, Gorgias, Protagoras, and you can even find eristic rhetoric in the Euthydemus. Aristotle was aware that his work and formalization on rhetoric could help arm sophists and lesser thinkers with a powerful tool. However, by him turning it into an art did open the door for less than honorable people to misuse it. Aristotle's key philosophical areas. Ethics. Nicomachean Ethics. Nicomachean Ethics is named after his son, Nicomachus. In his work, Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle discusses the concept of eudaimonia, which is translated into happiness or flourishing, which he believed to be the highest human good. Nicomachean Ethics in Book 1, Section 2 on happiness and flourishing, or eudaimonia, if there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else desired for its own sake of this. And if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, so that our desire would be empty and vain, clearly this must be the good and chief good. To break that down, Aristotle arrived at happiness is a result of exercising the virtues. Virtue ethics. Aristotle proposed that moral virtue is a habit and is found in the golden mean between extreme excess and deficiency. Example: courage is the mean between recklessness and cowardice. Metaphysics. Substance and essence. Aristotle explored what things are made of, substance, and what they truly are, essence, distinguishing between actuality, what a thing is, and potentiality, what a thing could become. Unmoved mover. In his metaphysical work, Aristotle introduced the concept of the unmoved mover, which is a fundamental principle that causes motion in the universe without itself being moved. Politics. The good life in society. In politics, Aristotle argued that humans are naturally political animals and that the purpose of the state is to promote the good life for its citizens. Mixed government. He advocated for a mixed form of government that combined elements of democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, believing it would provide stability and balance. Natural science. Biology and classification. Aristotle is considered one of the first scientists, and he categorized plants and animals into different groups, observing their behavior and anatomy. Teleology and nature. He believed that all living things have a purpose, and that nature does nothing without reason or purpose. Aristotle's connection with biology and zoology. While Aristotle is celebrated for his works on metaphysics and ethics, his contributions to biology and zoology are sometimes overlooked. He was one of the earliest systematic biologists, spending considerable time studying marine animals on the islands of Lesbos. His observations of marine life, particularly cephalopods like octopus and cuttlefish, are remarkably accurate. He even dissected animals and documented over 500 species, making him one of the pioneers of empirical biological studies. His work Historia Animalium, A History of Animals, contains the detailed descriptions of their anatomy and behavior. Lesser-known fact. Aristotle's classification of animals into two categories, blooded, which is similar to vertebrates, and bloodless, similar to invertebrates, influenced biology for centuries. Aristotle and his love for mathematics. Despite being less mathematically inclined than his teacher Plato, Aristotle made notable contributions to early logic and mathematics. His work in logic, including the development of syllogism, a kind of logical argument, is an indirect foundation for later mathematical logic. However, a lesser-known aspect is that Aristotle believed mathematics should be subordinate to metaphysics and empirical science. He held that mathematics could only offer abstract truths, but couldn't fully explain the complexities of natural phenomena. Lesser-known fact. Aristotle wrote a now-lost treatise on mathematics, on indivisible lines, which focused on geometric concepts and may have criticized the abstractness of mathematics. The anecdote of Aristotle's peripatetic teaching style. Aristotle founded the Lyceum, a school in Athens, where he taught for 12 years. One of the unique aspects of his teaching style was that he would often walk around while lecturing to his students, leading to the term peripatetic, which means walking around. The peripatetic school derived its name from this tradition. Aristotle believed that engaging the body through walking stimulated the mind and helped with learning and thinking. I actually agree with this and do this myself. In the past, whenever I've been thinking or on a business call or something, I always have to walk around, or there's definitely something to walking around. It gets your mind moving. Maybe it's not for everybody, but I can identify with this. Lesser known anecdote. It's said that Aristotle had two distinct styles of teaching at the Lyceum. One for the morning, esoteric, where he engaged in deep philosophical discourse, and one for the afternoon, exoteric, which was more public and accessible. His influence on music theory. Aristotle's contributions to music theory, particularly in his Politics and Poetics, are less frequently highlighted. Aristotle believed that music had a profound impact on human emotions and moral character, proposing that certain types of music could lead to specific emotional or ethical outcomes. For example, he considered that music in the Dorian mode fostered temperance and courage, while Phrygian mode could incite enthusiasm and emotion. Again, I completely identify this, especially as a musician. The different modes and whether it's a style of music or whatever can definitely invoke different feelings, emotions, and put you in a setting, just music alone. Lesser known contribution. Aristotle emphasized the educational and psychological value of music, arguing that it should be an essential part of a citizen's education in his ideal state. Aristotle's forgotten works on comedy. While Aristotle's Poetics is famous for its analysis of tragedy and drama, it is less well known that Aristotle wrote a second part on comedy, which was lost over time. The lost Poetics, too, might have explored the principles and mechanics of comedy in the same way that the surviving Poetics examines tragedy. Scholars have long speculated about the content of this work and its potential influence on the history of comedy. Lesser known contribution. Aristotle's theories on catharsis and the emotional release caused by art likely extended to comedy, making him one of the earliest theorists on humor and its societal function. Aristotle's ethical theory of friendship. While Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is well known, one of the most overlooked parts of his ethical system is his detailed explanation of friendship, philia. Aristotle saw friendship as essential to a good life and classified it into three types: friendships of utility, pleasure, and virtue. The highest form of friendship, according to Aristotle, was based on mutual respect and admiration for each other's virtues. Lesser known fact. Aristotle believed that friendships based on virtue are rare but necessary for a true friendship, and he considered them to be as important as justice in society. Aristotle's contribution to meteorology. Aristotle also contributed to early meteorology in his work Meteorology, where he attempted to explain natural phenomena like rain, wind, thunder, and earthquakes. Though much of his meteorological theories have since been debunked, such as his idea that winds were caused by exhalations from the earth, his attempt to provide natural explanations for these phenomena was an important step in the history of science. Lesser known contribution. Aristotle correctly theorized that stars did not generate their own light, which was a remarkable observation for his time. Aristotle's concept of potentiality and actuality. Aristotle's philosophical contributions include the development of the concepts of potentiality and actuality, which are foundational in his metaphysical system. He argued that everything in nature has the potential to reach a specific form or purpose, its telos, but that it must undergo a process of change to realize this potential actuality. Lesser known application. This idea deeply influenced medieval scholasticism and later metaphysics, where it was applied not to just natural processes, but to theological debates regarding the nature of God and existence. Aristotle's personal life, a humble appearance. Despite his intellectual stature, Aristotle is said to have been rather unimpressive in appearance. Ancient accounts describe him as short and stocky with small eyes and a lisp. His students, however, admired him for his intellect and teaching style. This anecdote highlights how, despite his physical shortcomings, Aristotle's mental prowess made him one of the most influential figures of Western thought. Aristotle's alleged funeral eulogy for Hermias. Aristotle had a personal relationship with Hermias, a ruler in Asia Minor, who was also a patron of his. When Hermias was killed by the Persians, Aristotle wrote a funeral eulogy praising his friend. This shows a personal and emotional side of Aristotle not often mentioned in his philosophical works. Influence and legacy. Influence on medieval philosophy. Aristotle's works were later translated into Latin and became foundational texts for medieval scholars, especially in Christian and Islamic philosophy. Influence on Western thought. Aristotle's thinking deeply influenced Western philosophy, especially in the fields of logic, metaphysics, ethics, and political theory. Aristotle's work covered a wide range of topics, from metaphysics and ethics to biology, physics, and rhetoric, making him one of the most influential philosophers in history. Conclusions. Do you think Aristotle formalizing and honing the art of rhetoric helped or hurt humanity? Socrates and Plato used mathematics and logic to drive their points home when engaged in dialectic. Aristotle diverged from his teacher by utilizing biology and empiricism. Do you think this was a paradigm shift that ultimately had a massive influence that led to modern science? What do you think Aristotle's most important contribution to philosophy or science was, and why? Why was Aristotle not considered a sophist? Do you think Aristotle had any impact on shaping Alexander the Great's mind, given he taught him when Alexander was only 13 and it was only for a short period of time? What is something you learned about Aristotle from either his life or philosophies that you can employ in your own life? Masters of Rhetoric, Episode 4, The Sophists. Sophists were a certain type of teacher in ancient Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries BC that taught for pay. These philosophers and intellects would teach the sons of wealthy and powerful people. The sophists would basically teach these young men how to win dialogues and debates using rhetoric, philosophy, natural science, and mathematics. Some would also teach athletics and music. Plato's dialogue Sophist was the first critique and analysis of what a sophist is. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were against the concept, and most of what is known about the sophists is found in the writings of Plato and Aristotle. They believed being a philosopher was something separate from being a sophist. They also believed it lacked virtue, since they were teaching young men rhetoric to be deceptive in dialogues and debates just to win. Socrates and Plato thought this way of teaching could never lead to true knowledge. It has been pointed out that some considered Aristotle a sophist and a hypocrite, since he was a paid tutor of Alexander the Great. However, he never accepted payment. Instead, he had King Philip rebuild his hometown of Stygia that Philip had destroyed in an earlier battle. Athens was the main hub for all of the sophists. Protagoras. Protagoras lived between 940 BC and 920 BC. He was born in Abdera, Thrace. He was a pre-Socratic philosopher. Protagoras was a student of Democritus. Democritus noticed his geometry skills and took him on as a student. However, Protagoras was not a fan of mathematics. If you recall, Democritus is the father of atomic theory. We discussed him in the pre-Socratic episode, so go check that out if you have not already. Protagoras was friends with Pericles. One of my favorite Pericles quotes is, "Time is the wisest counselor," which I don't know how anybody could argue with that. But Protagoras was dubbed a sophist by Plato. Plato said Protagoras invented the role of being a professional sophist. Protagoras, in Plato's dialogue, is a self-admitted sophist and called it an honorable ancient art that even Homer and Hesiod practiced. It ends with Socrates winning by insisting that all virtue is knowledge and that it can be taught. Protagoras was credited with the philosophy of relativism, which is based on his most famous quote, "Man is the measure of all things." This would suggest that there is no absolute or objective truth, and everything is relative to the individual. Aristotle said Protagoras was criticized for claiming to make the weaker argument stronger. In his On the Gods treatise, he wrote, "Concerning the gods, I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, or what sort they may be. Many things prevent knowledge, including the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life." He was a fan of agnosticism. Gorgias. Gorgias lived between 483 BC and 375 BC. He was a pre-Socratic philosopher, a sophist, and a rhetorician. He was from Sicily. He was a student of Empedocles. Gorgias was also considered the father of sophistry. Some debate whether Gorgias or Protagoras was a more influential sophist in their time. Gorgias was credited with the idea of a paradoxical thought and expression. He also developed some rhetorical innovations involving structure. Gorgias developed and taught a distinctive style of speaking. He was good at speaking. There is a debate of whether he was a nihilist based on some scholars' interpretations of his work. On non-existence, the quote, first, that nothing exists, second, that even if existence exists, it is apprehensible to humans, and third, that even if existence is apprehensible, it certainly cannot be communicated or interpreted to one's neighbors. His rhetorical works included Encomium of Helen, Defense of Palamedes, and Epitaphios. In Encomium of Helen, Gorgias defends Helen of Troy, which back then in the ancient world was not a popular take. Plato named one of his dialogues Gorgias based on a Socratic dialogue with sophists at a dinner party. Lycophron. Lycophron was a student of Gorgias. He was a tragic poet and grammarian. Aristotle called him a sophist. Aristotle also mentions him in his Politics. Lycophron may have been one of the first proponents of social contact theory. Lycophron said, "Communion is the cause of the unity of knowledge and the soul." He pondered whether part and whole are one or more than one. Lycophron argued that laws are merely conventions agreed upon by people, rather than rooted in any objective or natural order. This view aligns with the sophistic perspective that many aspects of society, such as morality and justice, are human man-made constructs rather than absolute truths. Prodicus. Prodicus lived from 465 BC to 395 BC. Prodicus was from Ceos and came to Athens as an ambassador to teach. He was a philosopher, speaker, and sophist. Ethics and linguistics were a major part of his teachings and speeches. Some have suggested that his style influenced Socrates. Plato treated Prodicus better than any of the other sophists and had great respect for him. Prodicus is most famous for his speech, The Choice of Hercules, or Heracles, however you want to put that down. The premise is Hercules is becoming a man and must choose one of two paths of life, either virtue or vice. Prodicus believed the gods were personifications of the sun, moon, and other natural phenomena. Hippias. Hippias lived during the 5th century BC. He was a philosopher and a rhetorician. He had a wealth of knowledge. Hippias was also a peer of Socrates. He would teach and lecture on grammar, history, mathematics, poetry, and politics. Plato thought he was arrogant, self-centered, and wrote the dialogues Hippias Major and Hippias Minor based on these qualities. He was credited with the concept of natural law, the idea that natural laws are objective and universal and independent of human understanding. Some suggested that his knowledge was abundant, but was also superficial and lacked depth in these subjects. Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus lived between 459 BC and 400 BC. Thrasymachus was from Chalcedon. His name translates to savage or fierce fighter. Most of his life was spent as a sophist in Athens. Plato noted him as a successful rhetorician in the Phaedrus. Thrasymachus was also a character in Plato's Republic, who was portrayed as willing to say anything to defend his position. He also demanded payment before responding to Socrates. Aristophanes made references to him. Antiphon. Antiphon lived from 480 BC to 411 BC. He was from Rhamnus. Antiphon was known as Antiphon of Rhamnus or Antiphon the Orator. He was the first of 10 Attic orators and logographers. He was active in the political scene in Athens. Antiphon was a statesman and a rhetorician. Antiphon may have invented giving political speeches in front of people. There is a long-standing controversy over whether he is the author of some sophistic works, including a treatise called Interpretations of Dreams. Some suggest that there was another Antiphon. He was a professional speechwriter for incompetent people. Cratylus. Cratylus lived in the mid to late 5th century BC. Some suggest he was somewhere around the age of Socrates or Plato. According to Aristotle, who mentioned Cratylus in his treatise Metaphysics, Plato was interested in Cratylus' philosophy before he found Socrates. Cratylus was a student and follower of Heraclitus' teachings and philosophies. In Plato's dialogue, Cratylus, he and Hermogenes ask Socrates if names are natural or conventional, whether language is meaningless or do words have some sort of intrinsic connection to the things that they represent. Heraclitus had the famous quote and claimed that one cannot step twice into the same stream. Cratylus took this idea even further and stated that it could not be done once, according to Aristotle. Cratylus' philosophy has been influential on Eastern philosophy. The Second Sophistic. The Second Sophistic is a revival of Sophism during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD after Rome overthrew the Greek Empire at the Battle of Corinth in 146 BC. The focus was on oratory and rhetoric. There was a mix of Greek and Roman sophists. The inspiration for the Second Sophistic was obviously the first wave of sophists in ancient Greece. Some notable sophists from this period were Philostratus, Herodes Atticus, Aelius Aristides, Favorinus, Lucian, Nicetas of Smyrna, and Diochrysostom. Cicero blamed Plato for creating the negative attitude towards sophists. Cicero was a rhetorician and part of the revival of sophism. Roman elites preferred to be taught Greek history over their own Roman history, which I think says a lot about how influential the period between the pre-socratics all the way to Aristotle was for philosophy and science and the evolution of thought. Conclusions. Do you think the sophists were the first people historically on record to let money corrupt truth? Who was the greatest sophist and why? I personally will throw my answer into there. I think Gorgias was, and I also believe that he took it a lot further than most, and he pushed the boundaries. Even though he was a sophist, he pushed a lot of boundaries, which I think made him the greatest sophist. He went all the way. What do you think were Aristotle's redeeming qualities that separated him from the sophists? Why do you think Cicero blamed Plato for the negative attitude towards sophists if what he was writing about was true? Here are some examples of modern-day sophists: politicians, PR and advertising, social media influencers, corporate and legal advocacy. Can you think of any more? Are we too far down the path of sophistry as a society that money binds us to bias for self-preservation and survival? Or will there be a time in the near future where AI can help us discern truth and weed out the bad actors? Masters of Rhetoric, episode number 5, Plato and the Sophists. Socrates lived between 470 and 399 BC. He was a classical Greek philosopher from Athens, a founder of Western philosophy, and was credited with being the first moral philosopher of Western ethical thought. He did not write or record any of his teachings or philosophies, but his students Plato and Xenophon did write his philosophies and teachings along with some other contemporaries. Plato's dialogues are the most comprehensive accounts of Socrates' teachings and philosophies, which highlight his contributions to ethics and epistemology. Socrates used Socratic irony to confuse adversaries in dialogues and debates. He also used the Socratic method, which would lead adversaries and his students to critically think and ultimately to conclusions that would contradict their initial position and help further their knowledge. He was falsely accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and was executed by way of poison, which was hemlock. Xenophon wrote that Socrates was a teleologist and suggested God arranges everything for the best. Socrates was considered a moral and just philosopher. He proved it in the way he lived and the way he died. Plato. Plato lived between 424 and 348 BC. He was a classical Greek philosopher from Athens. Plato was a student of Socrates, Heraclitus, and Parmenides. Plato founded the Platonist school of thought and the Academy, which was the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. Plato was credited with being one of the founders of spirituality in Western religion through a chain of Neoplatonic thinkers. Plato created the written forms of dialogues and dialectics. Plato was the son of Ariston and Perictione. He had a sister, Protone, and two brothers, Adeimantus and Glaucon. Glaucon was Plato's older brother. Glaucon was the interlocutor in the allegory of the cave, but is best known as the main conversant with Socrates in the Republic. Plato invented the theory of forms, in which he puts forth the idea that abstract objects exist outside the human mind. Platonic realism or Platonic idealism. The world of concrete objects and an unchanged, unseen world of forms or abstract objects. Plato studied in Egypt, Italy, Sicily, and Cyrene. Plato invented Platonic love and Platonic solids. Plato believed in the immortality of the soul. In the Timaeus, he has Socrates locate parts of the soul. Here we have our first sophist, Protagoras. Protagoras lived between 490 and 420 BC. He was born in Abdera, Thrace. He was a pre-Socratic philosopher. He was a student of Democritus. Democritus noticed his geometry skills and took him on as a student. However, Protagoras was not a fan of mathematics. He was a friend of Pericles. He was dubbed as a sophist by Plato. Plato said Protagoras invented the role of being a professional sophist. Protagoras in Plato's dialogue is a self-admitted sophist and called it an honorable ancient art that even Homer and Hesiod practiced. It ends with Socrates winning by insisting that all virtue is knowledge and that it can be taught. Credited with the philosophy of relativism based on his most famous quote, "Man is the measure of all things." This would suggest there is no absolute objective truth and that everything is relative to the individual. Aristotle said Protagoras was criticized for claiming to make the weaker argument stronger. In his On the Gods treatise, he wrote, "Concerning the gods, I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, or what sort they may be. Many things prevent human knowledge, including the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life." He was a fan of agnosticism. Gorgias. Gorgias lived between 483 BC and 375 BC. He was a pre-Socratic philosopher, sophist, and rhetorician. He was from Sicily. He was a student of Empedocles. He was considered the father of sophistry. He was credited with the idea of paradoxical thought and expression. He also developed some rhetorical innovations involving structure. He developed and taught a distinctive style of speaking. He was good at speaking. There is a debate whether he was a nihilist based on some scholars' interpretations of his work on non-existence, which is a lost original. First, that nothing exists. Second, that even if it exists, it is inapprehensible to humans. And third, that even if existence is apprehensible, it certainly cannot be communicated or interpreted to one's neighbors. His rhetorical works are an encomium of Helen, which is a defense of Helen of Troy, which for that time was kind of a crazy argument, defense of Palamedes, and Epitaphios. Plato named one of his dialogues Gorgias, based on a Socratic dialogue with sophists at a dinner party. Hippias. Hippias lived during the 5th century BC. He was a philosopher and a rhetorician. He had a wealth of knowledge, and he was a peer of Socrates. He would teach and lecture on grammar, history, mathematics, poetry, and politics. Plato thought he was arrogant, self-centered, and wrote the dialogues Hippias Major and Hippias Minor based on these qualities. He was credited with the concept of natural law, the idea that natural laws are objective and universal and independent of human understanding. Some suggested that his knowledge, while abundant, was superficial and lacked depth in subjects. Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus lived between 459 BC and 400 BC. He was from Chalcedon. His name translates to savage or fierce fighter. Most of his life was spent as a sophist in Athens. Plato noted him as a successful rhetorician in the Phaedrus. He was also a character in Plato's Republic and was portrayed as willing to say anything to defend his position. He also demanded payment before responding to Socrates. Aristophanes made reference to him as well. Plato's sophists. Plato's definition of a sophist can be pieced together from his dialogues, where he critiques their methods and practices. He generally defines a sophist as a professional educator who teaches rhetoric, persuasion, and virtue for a fee, but whose knowledge is superficial or deceptive. The sophists are often portrayed as relativists who prioritize success and persuasion over truth. Their aim, in Plato's view, is not to pursue genuine wisdom, but to win arguments and manipulate public opinion, often with little concern for ethics or the deeper meaning of virtue. Plato sees sophists as the philosophical opposite of Socrates, who seeks truth, virtue through dialectic reasoning. Plato's key definitions and criticisms of sophists. Teachers of persuasion, not knowledge. Sophists are skilled in the art of rhetoric, teaching others how to persuade, whether or not the argument is based on truth. In dialogues like Gorgias, Plato portrays sophists as using rhetoric to manipulate rather than to educate. Moral relativism. Many sophists, like Protagoras, hold the view that man is the measure of all things, suggesting that truth and morality are relative. Plato, however, believes in objective truth and regards sophists as undermining ethical standards by teaching that truth is whatever the individual or the masses decide it is. Monetizing knowledge. Sophists charge money for their teaching, while Plato contrasts with Socrates' pursuit of wisdom is done freely with no expectation of payment. In Protagoras is depicted as a wealthy and highly paid educator, while Socrates expresses skepticism about the integrity of those who profit from teaching virtue. Appearances over substance. Plato often criticizes sophists for focusing on appearances and superficial arguments rather than seeking true understanding. In Sophist, a dialogue dedicated to defining the nature of the sophist, they are depicted as imitators or deceivers who create illusions of wisdom but lack true knowledge. Here are some key examples from Plato's dialogues. Protagoras, which is an example of moral relativism and teacher virtue. Gorgias is a master of rhetoric and is indifferent to justice. Hippias. Hippias has superficial knowledge across many subjects. Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus are eristic debaters who focus on verbal trickery. This is something we've discussed a ton before, especially on the Mindscape podcast, which is eristic or eristic rhetoric, which is arguing for the sake of arguing or arguing to win without the aim of objective truth. Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus has that cynical, power-driven worldview on justice. Callicles. Callicles advocates for might over right and ethical relativism. Plato consistently critiques the sophists for what he views as their shallow understanding of virtue and their manipulation of rhetoric for personal gain, contrasting them with the Socratic pursuit of truth and moral integrity. From Plato's dialogue Protagoras, you have Protagoras versus Socrates. The premise is Socrates visits the house of Callias, where he meets Protagoras, a renowned sophist and a gathering of prominent Athenians. The interlocutors are Protagoras, Socrates, Hippias, Alcibiades, Critias, and Prodicus. The main themes of this dialogue are virtue and teachability, which the central question is whether virtue can be taught, nature of virtue. Socrates and Protagoras explore if virtue is one unified concept or a collection of individual virtues. Role of the sophist. The dialogue examines the sophist's role as teacher of virtue and whether they truly impart knowledge. Outcome. Protagoras argues that virtue can be taught using myth and poetry to support his view. Socrates challenges him, suggesting that virtue might be knowledge and questioning whether it can be truly taught. The dialogue ends without a definitive answer, but Socrates demonstrates his method of questioning as superior to the sophistic method of argument. In Plato's dialogue Gorgias, you have Gorgias versus Socrates. The premise is Socrates visits Gorgias, a famous sophist, to discuss the nature of rhetoric, its purpose, and its moral implications. The interlocutors are Gorgias, Socrates, Polus, and Callicles. The main themes are rhetoric versus philosophy. Socrates explores whether rhetoric is an art that seeks truth or merely a means to persuade. Justice and power. The dialogue delves into the ethics of rhetoric and its impact on justice, as well as the distinction between true power and the mere appearance of power. Hedonism and virtue. Socrates debates with Callicles about whether the pursuit of pleasure is the highest good. Outcome. Gorgias concedes that rhetoric, as practiced by sophists, can be used unethically. Socrates argues that rhetoric without a foundation in justice is harmful. He concludes that living a virtuous life, even if it leads to suffering, is superior to living unjustly. As I've mentioned before, I think Gorgias is actually the greatest of all sophists because he takes it the furthest, and you can look into previous episodes for me discussing that. In Plato's dialogue, Hippias Major, you have Hippias versus Socrates. The premise is Socrates encounters Hippias, a sophist known for his broad knowledge, and they discuss the nature of beauty. The interlocutors are Hippias and Socrates. The main themes are the definition of beauty. Socrates questions Hippias on what makes something beautiful and whether beauty is subjective or objective. Knowledge and expertise. The dialogue explores whether someone like Hippias, who claims expertise in many fields, truly understands the essence of what he discusses. Outcome. Hippias provides several definitions of beauty, but Socrates refutes each one. The dialogue ends without a clear answer, exposing Hippias' lack of depth in understanding despite his reputation. In Plato's dialogue Hippias Minor, you have Hippias versus Socrates. The premise is Socrates and Hippias discuss the nature of wrongdoing and whether it's better to do wrong intentionally or unintentionally. Interlocutors are Hippias and Socrates. The main themes are intentional versus unintentional wrongdoing. Socrates poses the question of whether it's more blameworthy to do wrong on purpose or by accident. Virtue and knowledge. The discussion touches on whether knowledge can lead someone to do wrong intentionally, contrasting sophistic and Socratic views on virtue. Outcome. Hippias is baffled by Socrates' arguments, which seem paradoxical. Socrates suggests it's better to have knowledge of wrongdoing, even if it means intentionally committing it, than an act out of ignorance. The dialogue exposes the weakness in Hippias' thinking and highlights Socrates' method of questioning. In Plato's dialogue Euthydemus, you have the brothers Euthydemus and Dionysodorus basically squaring off with Socrates. The premise is Socrates meets the sophists who demonstrate their heuristic skills by using tricky arguments. Again, heuristic is a form of rhetoric which is a debating style in which you are just debating to debate or arguing to argue to win, without the aim of truth or without trying to arrive at some sort of objective truth. The interlocutors in this are Euthydemus, Dionysiodorus, Socrates, and a young man named Crito. The main themes: eristic versus dialectic. Socrates contrasts the sophist eristic style with his dialectic method, which seeks truth, virtue, and wisdom. The dialogue addresses whether virtue and wisdom can be acquired through sophistic techniques. Fallacies and paradoxes. Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus use fallacies to confound Socrates and the others, exposing the emptiness of their approach. The outcome is Socrates demonstrates that the sophist's arguments, while clever, are logically flawed and do not lead to genuine knowledge. The dialogue illustrates the contrast between the sophist's manipulation of words and Socrates' sincere pursuit of the truth. Here are some of the specific examples of sophistry highlighted through Plato's dialogues. In Plato's Gorgias, you see rhetoric as a form of flattery. In Gorgias, Socrates debates with the sophist Gorgias, as well as his fiery student Polus and the ruthless Callicles. The core question here is rhetoric a true art or merely a form of flattery? Socrates argues that rhetoric, as practiced by sophists, is like pastry baking compared to true medicine. It pleases the audience without necessarily nourishing their minds. Callicles, in contrast, insists that might makes right, that power is the true currency of the world, and that laws are mere constructs of the weak to control the strong. What if Socrates is underestimating the practical value of rhetoric? Could there be a middle ground where persuasion serves the truth rather than distorting it? If Socrates had been more open to rhetorical techniques, could his message have reached a wider audience? In Protagoras, again, we learn, can virtue be taught? We see Socrates engage with Protagoras, one of the most famous sophists, on the nature of virtue. Protagoras claims that virtue can be taught and that he himself is capable of doing so. Socrates, ever the skeptic, pushes Protagoras into contradictions, exposing the weakness in his arguments. But here's the twist. Despite Plato's portrayals, Protagoras may have had a point. Modern cognitive science suggests that ethical behavior and critical thinking can indeed be cultivated through education. Was Socrates simply trying to dismantle his opponent rather than explore a synthesis of their ideas? If Protagoras was right, then the sophists may not have been the charlatans after all. Could Plato's depiction of them may have been politically motivated, designed to elevate Socrates at their expense? In Plato's dialogue, The Republic, you have Thrasymachus and the definition of justice. Perhaps the most dramatic clash comes in The Republic, where Socrates takes on Thrasymachus, a sophist who claims that justice is merely the advantage of the stronger. This is one of the most cynical yet pragmatic takes on power dynamics. Socrates, as usual, refutes Thrasymachus by showing that rulers often make mistakes, meaning that if justice is whatever the ruler declares, then justice must sometimes be against the ruler's own interests, an apparent contradiction. But let's step back. Doesn't Thrasymachus' argument resonate today? Aren't laws often shaped by those in power to serve their own ends? While Socrates is right in his logical dismantling, he sidesteps the reality of the political manipulation. Would Socrates' idealistic vision of justice hold up in our modern world of lobbying, corporate interests, and state propaganda? While Socrates may have won the philosophical argument, Thrasymachus' perspective remains eerily relevant. Perhaps the real question is, how do we reconcile philosophical ideals with political realities? Final reflections. Who really won? So who came out on top? If we follow Plato's narrative, Socrates emerges as the champion of truth and intellectual integrity. But if we take a more critical approach, the sophists were far from mere deceivers. They were pragmatic educators who understood the social realities of power and persuasion. The real lesson here is not to pick a side, but to integrate the best of both. What if we embrace Socratic questioning while also honing rhetorical skill? What if we sought truth, but also recognized the power of well-crafted persuasion? Perhaps this is the synthesis that modern philosophy and discourse need. That's it for this episode of Masters of Rhetoric. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive. Make sure you subscribe, leave a review, and share your thoughts. Do you think Socrates was right to attack the sophists, or do they deserve a reevaluation? Join the conversation, and until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep trying to master rhetoric.